So today I want to review the episode of Family Matters, Good Cop, Bad Cop. And I reviewed the Boondocks, and now I just want to review like Family Matters and just talk a little bit about the show and a couple of other things about it. And I decided to just start with this one because I know that this is kind of considered the best episode of the series and also a controversial episode. And what happens in this episode is that Eddie gets a speeding ticket, and later on in the episode, Carl says to him, Eddie, if it happens one more time, I'm holding your license for a year. You're not driving for a year. And what happens is that Eddie gets in trouble one more time, and he says that the cops put him on the ground and cuffed him, and they gave him like failure to signal, and then Carl just hears Eddie's story, and then he's like, okay, I'm gonna investigate, and then Eddie says something along the lines of, I think the worst thing that happened to me tonight is not how I was treated. It was really just that you don't completely believe me. And then Carl Winslow does his investigation, and he finds out that you know it was clear police harassment and police brutality, and then also there are a lot of like very poignant things to say. And then at the end they file a complaint. So I do want to talk about the whole episode. This is kind of like a summary. So there are some things that I did not like about this episode. I honestly understand with Family Matters and shows like this, I think they do a lot of just giving everybody a little bit of screen time. Like the first scene is Urkel, Laura, and Richie. And they do this for two reasons in a lot of shows. That number one, that sometimes people complain backstage. Sometimes the actors complain and they're kind of like, you know what, I want to be on the show. So they give everybody some screen time, and then also they get paid for their screen time. So it's just to kind of give everybody some time. So, Laura's making her money with this scene, and then with the opening scene with her and Urkel, with her watching TV with Urkel, and then, her fantasy of meeting musicians, and then the second scene where she's studying, and then Richie comes downstairs saying, like he has like a toothache, and then Richie and Urkel make their money because of the whole dentist scene. But the thing about it is that that's actually in bad writing, because with good writing, you don't kind of have any levity. You kind of make this, the whole point of this episode is really what happens with Carl and Eddie and police harassment and brutality. So when you have other things in it, it kind of ruins the tone a bit. But it's not well executed in this episode. But sometimes you need levity, or you need some comedy, because when you want to go dark, you want to go dark and make it impactful. Like for example, when you are watching Kill Bill, you see in Kill Bill Volume 2 the whole wedding scene, like people having fun, Bill saying, he kind of forgives her, he's going to let her live her life, and then you think everything is good if you have not seen the first movie, and then the shooting happens and all that. So it's kind of like what Tarantino's trying to do is make you feel happiness and calmness, so that when the tragedy happens to the main character, you feel more for her as she's getting her revenge. So sometimes you can have levity if it's going to help lead to an emotional just lead to an emotional juxtaposition, and then the emotion we want people to feel is more powerful. But not in this episode. It's more like, I think, kind of featuring everybody. And I also think that sometimes when you are a good writer, you choose to have a theme carry out through the entire episode. Like what would happen if Urkel and Richie kind of had their own opinion about police brutality, and they also heard about what happened to Eddie. I think then that would be a better writing. Or like another great episode is of The Sopranos, where in the first season Tony Soprano finds out that his daughter has a soccer coach, and the soccer coach is actually having sex with one of the students, is having sex with one of the players. So the whole episode is really about corruption. It is like how parents conspire, and what would happen if a mobster conspired on a soccer team, and that just means forcing the guy to stay, giving him gifts, threatening him if he moves on, and then also when they find that he's a bad guy, just saying that, what, he's choosing whether or not he wants to give justice by getting him killed, or he wants somebody else to do the justice for him. But the whole theme of the episode is kind of tied together by all the actions. It's everything. The whole episode's about corruption, but let's put a mobster in corruption when it comes to kids sports and all that. But this episode, I kind of think, talks about Eddie's issue, and then they talk about Urkel's issue, and then they talk about Richie's issue, and that kind of muddles it because it should be about one big thing, really. And I think one of the tragedies of this episode is that I think that this is Carl Winslow's best performance. I think he should have been nominated for an Oscar for this. No, for an Emmy for this episode, but I don't believe he was. So I do think that another thing that I really hate about this episode is, and it's also kind of funny too, that when he goes into the coffee shop and talks to these cops, he orders coffee and he says black, and I kind of like that because there's two meanings to that. I think he's trying to make the other officers feel uncomfortable by mentioning the word black. Oh, double standard. I meant like double entendre. Oh, well, since you guys harass black people, I'm just gonna say black to kind of like get at you. And I think the thing that I hate about the ending of this episode is that the woman comes with a Kreller and kind of interrupts their conversation. Because, when you have something very powerful or a powerful drama, you don't need that. So I think that honestly, you could have just done some reaction shots. You don't need to kind of have her give a line. And I think that's kind of what happens a little too much, where they kind of want to have other people like kind of speak, and that's not good. But I also understand if they may be like, okay, well, we have to have other people talk. We have to have other things go on because people want to feel involved. When it doesn't work for the episode, but there's also a sense of if they don't have a lot to say, they may say instead of doing a lot of commercials, we'll just kind of fill it up with filler. And I kind of feel that's kind of what I feel with Family Matters. It definitely has a lot of filler or giving people screen time when it may not work for an episode. But but I think that's kind of the technical side. But I also think that I didn't realize this episode was 1994. I was a kid. I was born in 1987. I thought this was done during the Rodney King riots, but Rodney King riots I researched was 1991. But there was a huge pattern of police brutality, and then also when cops did bad things, they would always get away with it because it's like white cops and like state governments are always going to side with the cops instead of the people that they harass, really. And it really wasn't until Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin and other people, it wasn't until like the mid 2010s where there was a lot more justice, but there's still a long way to go, really. So I think episodes like this, I think the theme of it is really that people need to be outspoken about police brutality, but people should complain and file complaints and do the right procedures instead of doing nothing at all or engaging in violence and whatever. And I think that's kind of a mixed thing because I do understand that number one, if a black man gets shot by the police and everybody's upset, and then a bunch of people are rioting and a bunch of black people are rioting, that does not help out. That adds to the stereotype, and that actually kind of proves those stereotypes true of why we need excessive police force to kind of keep people under control. So sometimes I do think that the message of overreacting and violence that they're trying to say in this episode is important, but I also think that the other side of it is that I think it would be a stronger episode if they kind of filed a police report and then what happens. Because I think another thing that could happen is, and this happens a lot, is that they will never investigate or they'll not care, or they'll be like, okay, well, we're gonna care this time because Carl is a police officer, so therefore it's gonna mean more because he's on the force. And I also think they talk about that a little bit in this episode about how there is police politics when it comes to racial harassment. And I appreciate them saying that. I like what Carl said, which is that, okay, well, I guess what you guys are saying is that we don't harass black kids who have parents who are in the force and other things like that. Like, I really think that a lot of their on the nose dialogue was very good. And I really appreciate that because they're talking about different issues. That some people have the mentality of, okay, well, if a kid's black or of another race and they're in a really like nice neighborhood, um, that just means they don't belong there. They're there for trouble, so it's perceived stereotypes, and then also that some people get passes because of who their parents are, and that happens too, with police brutality and racial profiling. Like I like AEW, so like people talk about Tony Khan, for example, like he's Middle Eastern, but obviously if he was not a son of a billionaire and people know who his father is, he would be treated differently. Like he would be treated way differently. He would probably get harassed during 9/11 and whatever. Like obviously being a billionaire helps, and being an entertainer helps, but regular people would not get the same treatment. Um, but I would kind of go back to that. I think there's a lot of talking points in this episode. I also think that it means a lot for me because I remember like I worked at a job and I was almost murdered by the police. And I remember like when the cops came into like what happened was I worked at an old job. I used to work at a store called Conway in Connecticut, and the security guards robbed the store. And I remember like when the cops came in, they were aiming guns at me. They're like, this was the Hamden Police Department, by the way. But I struggled with like depression and suicide for a couple of years, and it was also hard for me because I remember like my parents and my counselor that I was seeing was telling me, it just isn't a reason to get a better job. Like suck it up and get over it. So when I watch an episode like this, it kind of makes me a little emotional. But I also because I almost was murdered by the police. I know it's like to struggle with suicide and depression because of that trauma, and then also not get the help and be told just to move on, really, or you lived, move on with your life. Um, when that's actually the wrong thing to do. It's avoidance. But I do think that I like the message of don't hold your anger in, but also don't trash your neighborhood, don't riot or whatever, because both things don't lead to something. But just speaking out about it is important, and I've definitely done that in my videos and whatever, really. So I think this episode that's a really powerful theme. But I also think and I think like one other thing I don't like about this episode is that um, one thing I really don't like is that they had it where Eddie. I know they're trying to set up the story by having Eddie lie about a speeding ticket, and and then Carl doesn't believe him, and then he says that line, really. And I understand why they set it up because that kind of adds to possibly some doubt. But I really really think that what I don't like about it is I think like maybe at the end of the episode, I think Carl should have talked to Eddie and said, you know what, when you were not honest about your speeding ticket, that made me question. And you have to understand that whenever you lie and big things like this happen, it makes me ask some doubt because there are plenty of people who do lie about police brutality. So the same way there's plenty of women who do and do not lie about being sexually assaulted. I think that would have added to that episode. I do think that this episode has a lot of strong points, but it's definitely one of those things that's kind of like a B plus that could have been an A plus if they kind of had a little bit more development. But overall, very important episode. I think this is definitely a really great episode. I really think that Carl Winslow does a great job, but I do think that the episode is timeless, and that's kind of the important thing. I do think that one of the sad things about this episode is that I do think that it could have been very well developed. It could have been like an Emmy nominated episode, or this could have been an NAACP award a nominated episode. Like really, I think I wish Reginald I think Reginald Vell James is his name, or the guy who plays Carl Winslow. I really wish he was nominated for this or won an award. He really fucking deserved it. But yeah, it's definitely has a lot of talking points, but I also think that another talking point is that with police officers and a lot of people who have power, they always have to kind of understand that, okay, well, sometimes you do bad things and you hurt somebody else, and you're kind of like, well, fuck it, I'm off to the next day. I'm off to the next day in the office, but you don't realize the trauma and the anger and the frustration that somebody is going through. Like as my dad said, that sometimes it's just like somebody does something bad and they're like, they're not going to think about it or or they're probably gonna like have a laugh about how they got away with it, and some people are like that. So I do think that we should always just understand how our actions impact other people. So and that's also with if we're in positions of power to arrest people or be security guards or be in charge of other people's lives or safety. We always have to be respectful of those people. Like, for example, I work at a hospital, and I'll say this, that I remember one time I got mad at some of the nurses because there was a kid in the psych ward that was misbehaving. So they got mad because he just jumped over he jumped over a stand and went to the back offices, and they had to kind of apprehend him, put him in his room. And when the kid was in his room throwing stuff, they're kind of like smiling and making faces at him through at the glass window at the glass window's room. So he kept throwing chairs and whatever because they're trying to like instantly antagonize him just to tease him. And they've also told us that when you see staff members do that, you have to report them because that's harassment. And then also too, what does that teach that kid? That teaches that kid to hate staff a lot more, but it also teaches him not to process his feelings. And I also think that the other issue is that it just says to staff members, cross lines, when you can, really. So even in hospitals, there are people who are just naturally assholes. The same way there are cops that are naturally assholes, or there's some cops that just have bad days, and they deal with frustrating people, and they're going to take advantage of people who they can take advantage of. That could have been my situation with those police officers. But you know what? There is a huge power in treating people with respect instead of just being like, I'm a police officer, I can do whatever the hell I want. And then also too, for people who are victims of that stuff, it's always very important to report that. Like, I didn't know about complaints and other things like that. I wish I did that back then. And I also blame my father and my counselor very deeply because when I told them the stories and things that happened, they were kind of like, suck it up and move on. And as I said, that doesn't teach anything except, when bad things happen to me, it's not a big deal. But when other people do bad things to me, it's cataclysmic. So I also think that what Carl did was very good because he took it as far as he could take it, which is very, very important. And also I think what I like about him filing the complaint is that he's being a good cop in the sense that he's not like, okay, well, I can talk to somebody and then have you guys transferred to the most violent neighborhood and potentially get killed as my revenge or whatever. He could have easily done that, or be like, okay, well, I'm gonna talk to the right people and get you fired intentionally because I can abuse my power. So I like how Carl has power, but he doesn't abuse it because he has a good reputation. And then I think the last thing that I would say is that it's called Good Cop, Bad Cop. I used to think that was a reference to Carl, but I think it's kind of a reference to the two police officers, like Jack Evans, who does it, and then the rookie cop who's following Jack Evans, who did it. But is also on the fence of becoming good or bad, really. So I think that's really about, people who are becoming police officers who are not that far gone from making that choice, really. So I think it's a very powerful episode, a lot of talking points. And I'll be happy to review Family Matters, but I also think that I want to review the episodes that are cerebral. I know that there's a bunch of comedy or slapstick episodes, and I do want to avoid that because I'm all about serious content on this channel.